We are overjoyed tonight to have some convergence going on between the music world and the science world, because we have a guest who we have brought all the way from New York City. He does a lot of performances. He is renowned in this world of combining music and science. He is a Juilliard-trained concert pianist, performs around the world. He is also a professor of psychiatry at Weill Cornell Medical School, and he has diagnosed many of the great composers out there in retrospect by their music and their history. And I would like tonight to welcome Dr. Richard Kogan.
Now, here's a question that I suspect every person in this room has asked themselves. Where does creativity come from? We live or die by creativity because creativity is the foundation of original thinking. Whether you're in the arts or in the sciences, nothing is more prized, nothing's more valued, nothing is harder to come by than original thought. So with that in mind, where does creativity come from? The answer? Lots of different places. Now, one of the best, probably one of the most, I'd say, dramatic, inspiring, and ultimately tragic illustrations of this comes from the life and career of the great 20th century American composer George Gershwin. I'm going to share with you a story this evening because I think it has a lot to teach us about the mysterious twists and turns of our lives and how these can become the surprising fuel for our creativity. Now, part of what is intriguing about this Gershwin story is that he grew up in a home that was almost completely without music. He was born in 1898 in New York City. Parents were immigrants who struggled really just to put food on the table. George was an enormous behavioral problem as a youngster. He stole food from push carts. He regularly engaged in fistfights. He set fires. He vandalized property. He was a terrible student, inattentive, disruptive, could not sit still in the classroom. Now, his older brother, Ira, was George's temperamental opposite. Ira was courteous, soft-spoken, an excellent student. Whenever teachers sent home notes complaining about George's school performance, Ira intercepted them and assured the authorities that George would do better the next time. Now, it is challenging. It's difficult to do accurate retrospective psychiatric diagnoses on historical figures. I personally have enough trouble getting a diagnosis right with the living, breathing patients I see in my office, but I am convinced that a modern-day psychiatrist examining the young George Gershwin would give him a diagnosis of conduct disorder, probably additionally diagnose him with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, might start him on a psychostimulant medication like Adderall or Ritalin. These medications did not exist during Gershwin's lifetime. He still made a remarkable recovery. One day at school, a classmate of his, a little boy named Maxie Rosen, gave a violin recital. True to form, George was outside in the schoolyard playing hooky. But apparently the window to the school assembly opened out into the courtyard. And George said that as soon as he heard the first notes of this concert, he said he was so transfixed by the sounds, he decided on the spot he was going to devote himself to the study of music. And that's what he did. He befriended this kid, Maxie. He persuaded his parents to let him take piano lessons. Once he started, all the bad behavior, the fistfights, the stealing, that all stopped. It was almost as if his young brain had been this boiling, bubbling cauldron of disorganized, disruptive noise, waiting for some outside force to impose order, and that outside force turned out to be music. All right from the beginning, he had broad musical tastes. First piano teachers wanted him just to study the classics, Bach and Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert. He loved the old masters, but he wanted to take it all in. Broadway musicals, Harlem jazz, Yiddish theater. Drops out of school at age 15, takes a job as a song plugger for the Remick Publishing House on Tin Pan Alley. Works there for a few years, quits that job, forms a songwriting team with his older brother Ira, writing the lyrics. I mean, they clicked right away as a team. They wrote one hit song after another. The dynamics established between the two of them during their elementary school days persisted for the rest of their lives together. Ira's the responsible older brother, serving as a stabilizing force for his brilliant, hyperkinetic, sometimes totally disorganized younger brother. All right, January 1924, the 25-year-old George Gershwin putting the finishing touches on a musical called Sweet Little Devil, which is set to have a tryout in Boston before opening on Broadway. I was reading the morning newspaper, the New York Tribune. Notices an article about an elaborate upcoming concert organized by jazz band leader Paul Whiteman with the title of An Experiment in Modern Music. Now, for this concert, Whiteman assembled a panel of eminent musicians. We're going to listen to a series of new pieces by American composers and determine what are the defining characteristics of American music? What distinguishes American music from European music? Now, what caught Ira's attention was a sentence that read, "Among the works to be performed will be a concerto by George Gershwin." Ira showed the article to his brother. George said that he had a vague recollection of what he thought had been an informal conversation with Whiteman maybe a year earlier. The concert is 1 month away. Needless to say, he has not written a single note. But rather than panicking, he decided this would be a good opportunity to try something unprecedented. He was going to write a large-scale work that combined elements of jazz, pop, and classical music. And these were genres that at the time were considered to be distinct. So the next day he has to travel up to Boston by railroad. As he listens to the sounds of the train, the whoosh of the steam engine, the clickety-clack of the train along the tracks, as he listens to these sounds, virtually the entire construction of Rhapsody in Blue reveals itself to him. He had throughout his life a remarkable ability to extract music out of what others would have considered to be merely noise. You know, years later, he takes a trip to Paris. He notices that the Parisian taxi horns sound different from the taxi horns he's accustomed to hearing in New York City. Before he leaves France, he goes to an auto parts store, comes back to America with 4 authentic Parisian taxi horns. Nowadays, anytime any orchestra anywhere in the world plays that Gershwin symphonic masterpiece, An American in Paris, you hear those taxi horns. He incorporated them into the score. All right, let's get back on the train to Boston. Gershwin hears almost all of Rhapsody in Blue in his head, but he said there was one theme that he could not quite access. He said, "It's haunting me on the inside." Now, as soon as he gets to a piano, he said the following just oozed out of his fingers. Any of you who've ever... I was about to say, but I think you'll understand. Any of you who've ever flown United Airlines will recognize that scene. But, you know, that seems straight from the Broadway show tune tradition. But Gershwin refused to confine himself to one genre, so he added classical flourishes like... Those descending double octaves, that could have come from a piano concerto by Tchaikovsky or Liszt. And the entire piece is suffused with swinging, syncopated, jazzy rhythms. Every melody is colored by Gershwin's beloved blue notes. Now, blue note is an unexpected flattening of a tone in a major scale for expressive purposes. So you'll hear themes like this. All right, so Gershwin mixed elements of jazz, pop, classical music. He filtered them through his impressions of the sounds of that train ride, and he created a concoction that was unlike anything anybody had ever heard. I want to play it for you. This is Gershwin's own solo piano arrangement of Rhapsody in Blue. So, Rhapsody in Blue got an ecstatic reception from the first audience that heard it in Aeolian Hall, February 1924, but the music critics were considerably less enthusiastic. I mean, first of all, they were horrified by the mixing of genres. The critical consensus was that George Gershwin's a talented young composer, but he is terribly raw, and the piece structurally is a mess. He was stung by that criticism. He looked to redress his perceived deficiencies through an attempt to study with some of the world's leading composers. I told you about that trip he took to Paris. He went there because he wanted to study with the great French composer Maurice Ravel. Ravel didn't accept him as a student. He said to him, "You are a first-rate talent. If you study with me, you will become a second-rate Ravel." I want to tell you about his encounter with Igor Stravinsky, who at the time was probably the most respected composer in the classical music world. Gershwin met Stravinsky at a party. He approached him, asked Stravinsky if he could study with him, and then said, "By the way, how much do you charge for lessons?" And Stravinsky said, "Well, that depends. How much do you earn?" And Gershwin told him what he had earned in the previous year. Stravinsky said, "I would like to study with you." Stravinsky said he was always most struck by Gershwin's excess of nervous energy. The hyperactivity that he exhibited as a youngster persisted for the rest of his life. You kind of could hear it in his music. I mean, remember this from Rhapsody in Blue? I mean, tell me, could that have been written by somebody who was not hyperactive? Any of you know this Gershwin song? It's a song called, a song called "Someone to Watch Over Me." When Gershwin played that song, it sounded more like this. People said to him, "Why do you play everything that way?" He responded, he said, "We live in an age of staccato, not legato." Now, staccato is a musical term which refers to kind of abrupt, short, clipped, detached playing as opposed to legato, which is smooth and connected. I mean, this was the jazz age. It was the Roaring '20s. But I think Gershwin lived in a central nervous system of staccato and not of legato. But, even with the hyperactivity, the adult Gershwin would not have received an ADHD diagnosis if he had that hypothetical visit with a modern-day psychiatrist. As a grown-up, he had an excellent attention span. He was no longer prone to impulsive behavior. And unlike so many kids with a history of conduct disorder, he had no antisocial or sociopathic tendencies as an adult. I mean, George Gershwin's life was completely transformed by his exposure to music as a youngster. I mean, immersion in music effectively cured him of his ADHD, and his mental health remained fairly stable until his mid-30s, when he began struggling actually with anxiety and depression. He also fell into something of a creative slump. He also had around this time a couple of episodes of smelling burning garbage for no apparent reason. He knew he needed help. He consulted New York psychoanalyst Dr. Gregory Zilborg. Dr. Zilborg dismissed the olfactory hallucinations, but he started working with Gershwin on restoring his confidence and his ability to compose. Now, during the year and a half that Dr. Zilborg was treating George Gershwin in psychoanalysis, Gershwin composed what I consider to be his most startling and original work, and that is the opera Porgy and Bess. Porgy and Bess initially got even worse reviews than Rhapsody in Blue. I mean, yeah, the critical consensus was that Gershwin is an excellent composer of light-hearted Broadway musicals. He badly overreached in attempting to write a serious opera. Porgy and Bess was a commercial failure. It had a limited run, did not recoup its initial investment. Actually, Broadway theater was doing very poorly during this year. After the stock market crash of 1929, the Great Depression in the 1930s, Gershwin was forced to move from New York City, relocate to Southern California as a composer for Hollywood film. And it wasn't that long after he started living in Beverly Hills that the neurologic symptoms worsened. He experienced headaches and dizzy spells, balance problems, seizures. He actually had a blackout during a performance on a stage. He eventually lapsed into a coma, rushed to a hospital emergency room, did emergency surgery. They uncovered a malignancy in his right temporal lobe, a glioblastoma. Untimely death at age 38. It really makes one reflect, I think, on that last major work that he wrote, the opera Porgy and Bess. Because, Porgy and Bess, it's an opera. It's a story set in an impoverished African-American community in Charleston, South Carolina. It focuses on the protagonist, Porgy, who is a disabled beggar. Now, the story of Porgy and Bess encompasses a whole host of somber themes. I mean, there is poverty, certainly, racism, social injustice, drug addictions in there. This was a huge stretch for Gershwin. Up until this point, his entire output consisted pretty much just of peppy love songs. Even when he wrote the blues like this from Rhapsody in Blue. That's just not that sad, really. But Porgy and Bess required a much greater level of profundity, and Gershwin's music more than measures up to the emotional demands of the story. I mean, many of you will know the song Summertime, and the lyrics for that song, summertime and the livin' is easy. Fish are jumping and the cotton is high. Listen to how much poignancy, how much emotional pain Gershwin locates in those words. There's a later scene in which the character Serena discovers that her husband Robbins has been murdered. She lets loose this cry of anguish, a song called My Man's Gone Now. Remember, Gershwin was composing this while he's being treated for depression. I think with the benefit of hindsight, one can surmise that this depression might be explained by the mood changes that are so often associated with malignancies of the temporal lobe. Anyway, he did not live to see his ultimate triumph. At the time of his death, Porgy and Bess was judged to be the least valuable musical property in the entire Gershwin estate. The manuscript score for Porgy and Bess was evaluated at $250. I mean, nowadays, Porgy and Bess is universally regarded as the greatest opera composed by an American. All right, so let's revisit that original question. Where does creativity come from? I think sort of in the life of George Gershwin, you kind of see some suggestions that, first of all, it comes from finding your field, finding your calling. Second of all, it seems to come from the balance of a wild streak and a disciplined approach, whether combined in a team or in the brain of a single individual. And finally, creativity may even come from the fight against the worst that life has to throw at us. When life did that to Gershwin, when it imposed a death sentence on him, even though he didn't know it yet, he had intimations of mortality, as they say, and that very intimation may have led him to his ultimate creative peak. All right, I'm going to finish this evening. I'm going to leave you with just a couple of songs from Gershwin's Porgy and Bess. I'm going to play Summertime and Oh Lord, I'm on My Way.